So what I want to do today is to try to persuade you in thinking that not only when we read works of literary works we engage in a way in which we make use of mental imagery, but I also want to, I hope to do something more, which is to say that the sort of imagery that we experience when reading a literary work can be also an object of appreciation. And I have some ideas about that. I think my hypothesis is that particularly sensory descriptions can be a good candidate to figure as an object of appreciation within a literary work. So I want to start with a passage from Calvino, from Italo Calvino. Here I'm quoting Le Città Invisibili. You have the Italian version for the Italian audience and also the English translation. You can read it yourself. It's, I think most of you are familiar with that. It's a collection of, we can say short stories, maybe it's not the most appropriate term, but basically what you have are descriptions over and over of cities that you have never encountered. And my hypothesis is that this kind of work can only be, it has to be engaged by means of mental imagery, and also should be appreciated in virtue of the mental imagery that it elicits. So we have this description, I will come back to that later, but I want you to just to notice that it's not just a description where you have the form when you say this is how the city is made, but you also have kind of sensory motor imagery when he asks you also to walk on the little wooden tiles, careful not to set your foot in the open space or you cling to the end of strands. So why am I saying this? Because, for those who are familiar with that big debate that has been going on for quite some time, so fiction and imagination, mental imagery has kind of never been present in this discussion. So, at least since Kendall Walton Mimesis as make-believe, we've been working with, related specifically to works of fiction, with this notion of propositional imagination. When it comes to Walton, he uses make-believe to say that when we engage with a work of fiction, we make believe that the propositions are true in the work of fiction. We have different ways in which other authors have developed these positions, with specific relation they have to the elective commitment, but some of them they refuse also to use the term imagination, switch to supposition or entertainings. But the thing is, this also kind of, at least in my opinion, caused from the philosophy of literature disappearance of what I think it's a pretty common experience of the phenomenology of reading a literary work, which is to have mental imagery. So I'm not the first one to say this. Here I've reported two quotes from Dustin Stock's paper of 2019, where he just denounces the absence of mental imagery from the debate. Here we can read, Kathleen Stock excerpt from All Imaging, where she says that when we're engaging with a work of fiction, we don't need imagery nor anything particularly experiential. And then we have 11, where he kind of tried to say that certain propositions are very difficult to be executed in terms of mental imagery, but this doesn't kind of preclude us in principle to say that other proposition can instead be imagined in this quasi-perceptual way. So I just want to make a disclaimer. Of course, I'm not just talking about works of fiction, I'm talking about literary works. So, of course, we have to broaden the spectrum of today's presentation. And I want to distinguish between two modes of engagement, what I call a minimal or skeletal engagement, which just amounts either to make believe that something is the case or just to follow the story in a very minimal, in a very basic sense. And that's also what kind of Walton has in mind in his book, when he particularly argues that make believe intended as propositional imagination is just a minimal way of engaging with the work of fiction. And we can have also what I'd like to call a fleshed out engagement, which will amount to realizing the responses entirely invited by the work itself. As Susan Fabian would say, we are inclined, when we are engaging with a literary work, to get the most of the value out of it. So, but then also we have something more. We have a position that I'm calling today a nativism about literary imagery, that argues that given the fact that there is no space for mental imagery in the engagement of literary work, if not at a subjective level, therefore it cannot of course feature as an object of appreciation. Peter Givi, in his essay Reading a Representation, devotes quite some pages on this issue, and he tried to convince us that sensory description, which are what I'll be concerned today, even though I don't deny that maybe there are, of course, spaces for mental imagery also in other, not just in sensory description, but also in other parts of the literary work. He says to us that the function of this description is to provide aesthetic enjoyment about literary language. And this is one of the functions. And the other function that he individuates is that the description have the function of providing information about the story. That's it, nothing more. Even though we have mental imagery of that, this is just either incidental or is ancillary. And then we have Zandwill in his Metaphysics of Beauty, that he tells us that even when we are processing description that promotes imagery, and we are astonished and we are inclined to judge them as beautiful, what we are judging is not something that is related to the work. It's not the mental imagery as related to the work, but instead we are amazed, in a sense, by our own imaginative abilities. So what I try to do is to see if there is some space to challenge this sort of positions. So before moving on, just some words on what is mental imagery. Mental imagery, here I'm using a framework that has been developed in the past 7 years by Vincenzo. I'm just generally referring to his last book, but you can find plenty of papers from him. So he has this definition of mental imagery as perceptual processing without a direct external stimulus. So that means, according to him, that mental imagery and perception belong to the same kind of mental state. This is a claim that we also can find, for example, we can date it back to Kant, but here mental imagery is considered in, let's say, kind of, in the dimension of cognitive science, so, and also neuroscience, of course. Given that they share the same sort of, they belong to the same kind of mental state, mental imagery as perception will exploit all the sensory modalities that we have. So we don't just have visual mental imagery, but we have auditory imagery, gustative imagery, haptic imagery, and so on and so forth. And mental imagery seems to be very pervasive in many aspects of our mental life, and also not just in cognition, but in perception, action, and execution. For what it regards cognition, you can think about episodic memory, where mental imagery thought to be an essential, a crucial aspect in processing language, and now we're going in the direction where several researchers are starting to try to understand the correlation between emotion and mental imagery, and to the extent that in certain cases it seems that only mental imagery could be understood as triggering certain kind of emotions, at least very raw ones like gut-like reactions, for example. So if we want to understand mental imagery literary works, we of course have to start from reading processing. So we've known for quite some time, actually Peter Kivi comes before the research from Pedro, so you might not have known, but the thing is that I guess it's safe to say that it's quite now acknowledged that we exploit mental imagery when we are processing languages. So it also has some key aspects in our semantic understanding. But the thing is that Alan Pivio thought that when we are processing language, we are doing that what he calls the dual coding theory of cognition. So we have two types of cognitive codes involved in language. One is the verbal code, and the other one is the imagistic one. And we have also more recent research that tried again to reinforce this kind of theory. We have Bergen, who demonstrates how subjects employ imagery to respond to linguistic stimuli, and also Garcel, who works in the wider field of embodied cognition, who thinks and has participated in many experiments that when we are processing language, we're having something like sort of perceptual simulation of the denoted object. By the way. And then we have a great list of people outside of the philosophical field in what it's called the field of cognitive literary science, which is a blend of literary theorists interested in cognitive science and vice versa, that have, for a long time acknowledged the fact that mental imagery features in a strong way in the phenomenology of reading literary works. So, for example, Anechka Kuzmikova distinguishes between two main classes of mental imagery, what she calls verbal imagery, which is imagery of auditory imagery of language. She actually has two subcategories in that. She thinks that, for example, we have something like a dialogic imagery, so imagery of dialogues, but she also thinks we have what she calls rehearsal imagery, which should be something like we can understand it in silent reading. So the imagery that we have of our inner speech while reading a literary work. And also, which will be of my interest today, we have referential imagery. So we have representational imagery of what language knows. And this class of imagery comprises of three subcategories. Enactment imagery, she says that sensory imagery from within. Description imagery, which is the most common form of it, experienced from outside. And then we have what she allows just for the case of representation of environments in between imagery. So imagery both from within and outside. And that's kind of what I think that the Calvin description of the city of Octavia falls under this subcategory. I don't think that we should allow this just for the representation of environments. I don't think there's any reason to think so, but she doesn't really give any good reason to think that this should be restricted just to the representation of environments. Another researcher in this respect, doesn't open more, is Dorsch, who criticizes actually Anechka Kuzmikova, because the main claim of Kuzmikova is that we experience sort of what she understands as vividness, only when we're processing what she meant as enactment imagery, so the sort of sensory motor imagery that we experience from within. And then we struggle in processing sensory descriptions, especially the ones with many details. But we'll work on that, I think. And so Renate Dorsch tries to overcome, because she's entirely unsatisfied with that. She thinks that sensory descriptions, especially ones with also lots of details, happen to be to engage us in a way that they result very vivid to us. And so she extrapolates this criterion from this work by this neuroscientist, Madeleine Julie, who argues that for different reasons, vividness is common both for what she calls dynamic imagery and static imagery. So the dynamic imagery, it's related to a short latency, which we have to understand is at the speed of generation of the image. So when we are processing imagery that is associated to action-oriented passage, which is analogous to action vision, the speed of the generation of mental imagery is way more faster than the ones that we are processing when we're reading a sensory description, which takes more time. But she says, again, that we have empirical evidence to assert that also when it comes to sensory descriptions, we can have very vivid imagery. Why? Because she thinks that analyzing this data, that the maintenance of the image is what allows us to experience this sort of vividness. I don't know why she wants, again, in a much more critical way with respect to Smigova, to maintain this clear-cut distinction between dynamic and static, between this sort of sensory motor imagery and this sort of object visualization. I think that most of the times in descriptive sequences, they can come together. I don't see a reason to keep them as apart, and so that we can switch from one to another. And I'll tell you what I think is kind of a wider distinction that may comprise them both and account for maybe such a complexity. So I think that if we want to preserve just the latency of the generation of the image, we may find some ways to do it by resorting to this distinction, guided versus unguided imagery. So unguided imagery, which should be associated with the short latency of the generation of the imagery, is understood as effortless, low-level, spontaneous, and part of the rigid flow. And so, just to make an example, in the paper I use this example of encountering the word within a very abstract passages, very abstract sequences, not descriptive sequences, so sequences whose primary task that they pose to the reader is not the one of describing. And we encounter at a certain point the word, the mention of a red carpet. So in this case, we may have imagery of the red carpet, but I want to argue that this is not strictly demanded by the text, insofar it doesn't fall within the task of processing a description. So the imaginable word appears isolated and may or may not be consciously instantiated by the reader. Instead, what I'll be interested in today is this sort of imagery that I want to call guided imagery. Guided imagery is actually something that originated in psychology. It's used in psychotherapy to cope with a variety of issues, anxiety issues, or even drug addictions, and it seems to have at least some beneficial effects on the patients. But the thing that I'm interested in is that guided imagery works by means of several stages of processing. So, in contrast to unguided imagery, when we are experiencing guided imagery, we have not just the generation of the image, but we have its maintenance, which is prolonged for more than the usual. Usually, we maintain a mental imagery in our mind for no more than 250 milliseconds. So, if you want to retain it for more time, you have to exercise a certain attentional control. And so you can expect it, and you can allow for further transformation, which is good for sensory descriptions, because it happens that we have to assemble different images together in order to get to the bigger picture. So, in this case, guided imagery, of course, is not specific to literary works, but I think we can find it in literary works, and it's what we can understand as sensory description. So, in literary works, guided imagery is exemplified by sensory description because, precisely, we have something that by Kuzmikov herself is called sensory description processing, which are those passages that describe something by means of a higher density of imaginable words, which results in higher cognitive costs, and that's what precisely slows down the reading pace. Unfortunately for Kivi, he didn't acknowledge this kind of mode, and even though he admits that descriptions slow down the reading pace, he probably, wasn't aware of the fact that the reason why they slow down the reading pace is that because they impose a higher cognitive task on the subject. So, what I think is the main difference between them is with respect to how attention is involved, and precisely guided imagery involves attentional control, while unguided imagery doesn't necessarily do so. We may be struck by an incidental imagery that we find across the text, and we can feel like we want to indulge in it, but I don't think that is what is required by the literary work. So, I think that now we're starting to get in a position to understand that sensory descriptions can become object of appreciation insofar they have the capacity to elicit mental imagery. So, guided imagery literary works is exemplified by sensory description in virtue of the distinctive mode of processing. Sensory descriptions guide imagery by asking the reader to exercise these several stages of generation, maintenance, inspection, and transformation that must be done with a special attentional control over them. And so sensory descriptions, while guided imagery, are particularly suitable as object of appreciation in literary works. And this is, I think, a good way in which we can vindicate the claim that Albino descriptions are vivid insofar they require a special involvement of the reader. You may think that probably Albino description are vivid just for me and not for you, but interestingly, we have also other, I think, reasons to believe that this is not just something subjective, but something interpersonal. There's some research and literary criticism on that by Politi or Franco Ricci have explored this idea between the relation between the word and the imagery in Calvino, and Calvino himself in his 6 memos in the Lezioni Americane, 6 memos for the next millennium, declares that this is exactly what pushing toward writing. So he wants the reader to feel the aspect of the work as tangible as possible. And then, yeah, we come to a conclusion which gets me back to the title of the presentation. So, actually, Roman Garden, in the cognition of the literary work of art, which is the follow-up to probably his more famous work on the ontology of the literary work of art, had something to say about the role of what he called aspects, and then we can nowadays understand better under the label of mental imagery in the literary work as something that has to be engaged by the reader in order to get to the constitution of the aesthetic value, which for a garden is it comprises of the apprehension of the fourth strata that composes the ontological structure of the literary work. And he thinks that the fourth strata is precisely the one of the aspects, the aspectual stratum. So I'm just reading some bits from this quotation. The stratum of aspects plays a most significant role to the constitution of the aesthetic value. The reader must perform a function, he says, analogous to perception, and we can make sense of that insofar the idea of making what is portrayed in a quasi-perceptible way, no more in a purely literary way, but as if we were witnessing on stage or on film. So the reader has to actualize in the first place and then concretize these aspects in his own imagination. And if the reader is concerned, as he certainly ought to be, with reconstructing and viewing in his concretization the form proper to the work, then he must not proceed arbitrarily in the actualization of the aspects. So, in Garden, it's not so clear when it comes to what he counts to the sort of imagery that is counted in the aspectual stratum. It seems he makes like reference just to sensory descriptions, but at a certain point it seems to suggest also that there could be something more. But it's very hard to extrapolate some further meaning from that. And sticking to sensory description, which I think is what is the most suitable way in which we can understand mental imagery as an object of appreciation in literary works, I think that in Garden itself we find some resources also to acknowledge why mental imagery, sensory descriptions qua guided imagery in literary works are different from the sort of sensory descriptions that we can find also in analogous contexts that are not artistic related. So one is the fact that, as he says, the stratum of the aspect forces attention over the reader. I'm trying to make sense of this. I think that something that we have to preserve is the fact that literary imagery, at least in principle, prima facie, has no other function than redirecting attention as it is alone. And that is on the sensory description precisely qua the capacity of evoking and guiding mental imagery. So accuracy condition doesn't matter. When we're reading a sensory description, we are not concerned to accuracy condition, to how much is accurate with respect to the object that it represents. And again, also concerning other contexts, which could be, for example, the context of advertising, when a copywriter can make a pitch that prompts us great imagery. We don't find, we have in that case an external purpose. We have a value that is instrumental, but in this case, usually in literary imagery, there is no external purpose. And the second and last characteristic that we can extrapolate is the fact that the sort of imagery that we experience, or that we should at least be careful in experiencing, is highly dependent on the work. So, when we say that certain descriptions are great in the way of conveying imagery, our judgment is directed on the sensory description insofar it enables the formation of mental imagery. And readers are not free to realize the aspectuality as they prefer. They are not free to imagine the city of Octavia as a city upon the hill. They have to stick with what is written, so they have to have imagery of that as a city that is suspended upon void. And of course, they can add certain elements, and this is probably the most difficult stage of in gardening thought. But when they do that, they will always have, in a sort of sense, as I say, to stick with a sort of principle of coherence with respect to the work. And so I think that was the conclusive slide. Thank you for your attention.